you have a cell phone? I want to put mine on silent right now.
Yeah, mine is turned off, all
Okay,
of mine.
perfect. Okay. Thanks for coming down, Mrs. Atherton, and sharing your story with us. I'm just going to start with a couple questions, and we can just converse from there.
All right.
Okay. Can you tell me who you are and what you do?
What do I do?
Yeah, or what you've done.
For the Red Cross, or for, in other words,
Away from the Red Cross, what you would do.
away from the Red
Right,
Cross.
in your normal life.
I'm on the
You have to state who you are first.
what's it called now? Honolulu Academy of Arts, a museum board, and I've dropped most everything else that I used to be on. Okay.
Yep, that's good. It's a good start. Just making some last minute adjustments here.
You just have to speak a little louder for her.
Okay. So can you tell me what your name is?
My name is LeBurtha Gates Atherton.
And how long have you been with the Red Cross?
I guess a good many years. I have no idea.
Do you remember when you first got involved with the Red Cross in Hawaii?
In Hawaii, during the war, starting of the Second World War.
Do you remember, well, how did you get to Hawaii and where did you come from?
Well, I originally was from Denver, Colorado, and my parents did a great deal of traveling. I had a little sister who had double mastoid, which was a serious health problem in those days, and so my father had to found out about, well, wanted to get away for at least 2 months or 3 months during the wintertime. I ended up marrying a descendant of the missionary family, and I think that, and so when the war came, I had just been married, and my parents who had arrived from the mainland decided that they better get out of here, so they were able to get on a plane. I guess, were there planes in those days, commercial planes? And I think it was a commercial plane that they got on and went on back to the mainland. But I, having just been married, decided I would stay in the islands. So we who were young married couples who had children left for the mainland too. But all of our friends who had children, well, they immediately left. They went to the mainland with their children, as Punahou was closed at that time for Navy and Army reservation, Navy and Army groups, I guess you would call it. I was among the few who stayed in the islands because I felt responsible for the war and because I was newly married. I'm going around in circles. I'm sorry.
No, this is good because I don't know any of this story. Anything you could tell me would help a lot. So
all right.
Were you a volunteer before you got here in the Red Cross, or was this?
Oh, I was born the year the Red Cross started. Happened to be born that year, and I had a picture that had me standing by I could just stand up by a little baby bed, doll's bed, and I had a bandana around my head which had a big red cross on it. And I never knew what it was all for in the old days.
So you ended up being born into it.
So I ended up in Honolulu, and my husband was over at Kaneohe Naval Air Station. So I stayed here. And the ones who were doing this type of work had volunteered to help any wives that stayed on with their husbands were helpful. We all were Red Cross volunteers, really. I had done this type of work for many years, just as a volunteer.
I think everyone knows how serious Pearl Harbor was, but
yes.
Can you put it into perspective as a person who was there when it happened?
Well,
How big was this?
I hate to tell you, but I was still asleep when it happened. And I was on, my husband and I were, he was at home at that point. He was just going to become a Navy talent, Navy intelligence person. And so I was going to, I get a little flustered. I decided I would just stay right here in the islands with my husband, who could come in every fifth day from the other side. I was able to see him every fifth day for a short time, but that made it a different day all through the year. And all the wives who are, service people, wives, left the islands. They were sent back to the mainland. So we, as island people, I was not an island, well, I considered myself an island person at that point because I'd been down here so much. And I'd gone to Punahou and graduated from Punahou, and so anyway.
What kind of work did you end up doing right after Pearl Harbor?
Right after Pearl Harbor, I, let's see. Well, I made bandages as a Red Cross nurse, or volunteer, really. And I got into the, I'm having a horrible time.
Can you tell me, you are not a nurse by training, yes? Did you have any medical training prior to your volunteer?
No, we didn't have, the only medical training we had was volunteer whenever there was any big accidents or anything like that. We would go to through the Red Cross.
Did you?
And I became a member of the Red Cross, probably the Honolulu Red Cross. I guess just as the war started.
Do you ever remember feeling, did you ever feel intimidated, you know? Did you ever feel like, I don't know what I'm doing? Was there good training? Or did you
No, it was good training. We had volunteered to do any type of work necessary, and I became a gray lady, what they called gray ladies. I don't know why, because we were still in our 20s, but for the Red Cross. And so as soon as the war started, we pitched in immediately and started making bandages for for the Red Cross, which passed it on to the service people. Then we also made helmet covers. I had sort of myself had made fishnets for my husband, and so I kind of invented this little one that would go right over a helmet, and I became a volunteer for the Red Cross, brought that to them with the idea of making these helmet nets to go over their helmets so they could stick leaves in them all around and be camouflaged. They could put that on. And then in Red Cross, we volunteered to, we first made bandages, then I worked on, I wasn't very active in the Red Cross too much before I became married and the war started, and there I was. So I immediately volunteered for Red Cross, and we were making bandages. And then I discovered how to make a net, sort of made a design for a little fishnet in a ways. And we started making these helmets, which was just like a baby fishnet.
You know, during this time, the threat of another, attack from the Japanese was fairly real, was real.
Yes, it was very definitely real. We built a shelter in our front yard, which was all sand. And I was more scared of the bugs than I was of the war. But so luckily, with the job I had out at Shafter, I would supposedly have to get into the bomb shelter, but then I realized that I was among the few volunteers still left in the islands, because so many of them had children of my friends. And so I made bandages for them, and I made the helmets for them, and then I worked in the Ward Center, Women's Air Raid Defense.
What did you do there at the
Women's Air Raid Defense?
Yeah, what is that?
It was in a tunnel in Honolulu. I don't know, so past, I'm sure everybody knows where it was. The Fort Shafter was a volunteer. They had a huge board in there, and the different stations around the island would report to young volunteers who had earphones on, and they would say, this big big table was in this tunnel, and we would get the reports from the different places. I started out listening to it and plotting on this big board where it would be B12, say, and I would know that was a volunteer. And so then we would plot it on this big board, B12, put one there, and then another station might come in and they would say B14, and somebody would put one there, and then they'd have another number, and eventually we would plot it. They would decide where the plane was going, and we would immediately ask the Navy, Army, Marine, anybody who had planes flying, how they volunteered. It was the Navy and Army officers who had volunteered. Well, now let me start again. After we had made many bandages. They would put us in this room, and then we were called Women's Air Raid Defense, and we would.
You were tracking the planes.
We would track them by plane, and then we'd ask them, and then we would ask any of them up there, do you own this, or you have a plane on this route? And if they said no, then we would send the fighters, the interceptors, out to see what they were doing, what was happening. And if they weren't able to identify it, then they would have to send the fighters out.
You know, it sounds like it was a very dangerous time.
It was a dangerous time.
But it also sounds like you had a very exciting time.
But it was a very exciting time, yes. And finally, they sent all the Army and Navy wives home. So, as I say, we volunteered to do that type of work. We who wore the uniforms, the blue uniforms.
Did you? I know we talked a little bit about digging, your foxhole and your shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, you had to have it big enough so that you could get down in it and be covered over. It had a lid on it. We got a piece of plywood, put a lid on it, then put the sand back on it, and made it look just like the yard, and there was a small opening in it. You could get probably about 3 to 4 people inside it.
How many people had shelters?
This was a small shelter, a private home shelter. And I didn't like it because I didn't like the bugs that were down there. So when I became a ward, as we were called, I would be very happy because I could get onto the station and I could follow through with what they were doing because I knew all the codes. And so I could tell whether they had identified it or not. Or if they hadn't identified it, then I wouldn't go in the shelter, even they told us to, because I was able to tell what it was.
Behind you we have, there are 2 uniforms. There's a blue uniform and a gray uniform. Do you remember wearing those?
The blue uniform, I think, was so that we could, I'm trying to think why we had a blue and a gray. Gray was for wrapping bandages, and blue was volunteer work. And we would feed the men sandwiches, food of all kinds. What else did we do? Well, beside the bandages.
Did you work with wounded soldiers? Did you work with people coming back from overseas?
Yes, I did. I worked for them to go to the hospital and try to cheer them up and write them letters which were written, help them write letters to their families as a volunteer. We also...
What would you say in these letters?
We would copy down whatever the officer wanted us to say to them and get it all ready, and then we'd get their hand and get them to sign it themselves if they were able to. We found telephone numbers for some of them, and in those days it was kind of hard to get the number. because telephones were quite limited then.
So you would actually handwrite the letters for them?
We'd handwrite the letter for them. They would sort of dictate to us, and we would handwrite the letter for them, and then we'd get them to sign it, and we'd mail it free of charge.
Do you remember any one person or letter in particular, any one soldier or airman or sailor that you helped with this task?
Well, let's see. Well, most of the people who were left there were officers and of the Army or officers in the Navy, and we would volunteer our time. My husband was in the Navy, which was very nice, and although he was stationed over at Kaneohe Naval Air Base then.
Okay, am I on the right track here?
Yeah, I think we're getting some great stories.
Yeah.
I saw pictures in some of our archives of gray ladies reading newspapers to the wounded service members or bringing them magazines, and just as you mentioned, trying to cheer them up.
Was it difficult work? I mean, was it emotional for you? Or was this easy? Was this something you liked doing?
Well, let's see, I'd been a Red Cross nurse volunteer for many years, and we would make the bandages. Let's see, what else did I do? And we'd talk to the officers and try ask questions about their families and their children if they had any, and helped them write these letters to send home. If they'd lost an arm, why, they couldn't write anything, so we would write it for them.
Do you remember when the war ended?
It was
I think it's 1945.
1945, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because I know that my husband said we couldn't have any children until the war was, we were on the safe side. And so as soon as everything was peaceful and calm, and we knew we were on the return cycle, we were on the good side, ahead of the game, he said, okay, so I became pregnant, and then I had to stop the Red Cross and stop all of that and go into the Navy. I mean, go into retirement in a way, while I had my first child.
And who was that?
That was, her name is Balby Brooks. Now, she was married, she's divorced. I think she and her husband were closer and have been closer since they've been divorced than they were when they were married.
Have you talked to her by any chance about your time in the Red Cross? Do your children know what?
Oh, they know pretty well about it, yes. And I've told them all tales that went on during those years in Shafter. I think I relayed it to them in every way I could at the time.
So the
but
war is
we
over.
weren't as worried. They gave us Army and Navy tags as volunteer workers, and the young officers would get enough money for a bottle of liquor for a year, for say this month they got a bottle of liquor or beer or whichever they wanted. Some of them didn't drink or smoke or anything like that, so we would trade them and take their tags away from them and give them, write as a volunteer, write letters and messages to their wives, to their husbands. Then, besides wrapping up bandages, making helmets, helping with the enlisted people, and helping in any way we could through the Red Cross, and being able to see what, in other words, to help make them happier, make them feel more at home.
So the war comes to an end, and you plan on having your first child. Did you think about leaving Hawaii? I mean, did you think about it? Must have been an option to go back to the mainland.
No, I didn't. My family came back over here to the islands as soon as they could the next winter. And they had gone to California every winter. Home was in Denver, Colorado, and that would get very cold during the winter time. So my parents would go out to California then. And then I would, but once again, they would come as soon as they could. They came back to the islands.
So you had your children here. They grew up here?
Yes, they grew up here, all three of them. Mm-hmm. And that was before we were a state. We were still a territory.
Did you continue to, or when did you get back into Red Cross service?
I guess I was always sort of a member of the Red Cross. I think during the war I was with the Red Cross, and then after the war I'd be available for any volunteer work, let me say.
At any point you could have said, I've done enough. I worked in during wartime. I worked afterwards. You had other things to do. Why continue to work with the Red Cross?
I thought it was a very worthwhile affair, and I think the Red Cross is one of the top-notch volunteer jobs that is something that carries on for every year. I feel that the Red Cross does more for our country than any other organization does, volunteer organization. I think that they're worth every bit as much, worth everything they do, and in volunteer ways.
What would you tell someone who is interested in volunteering for the Red Cross but isn't sure that they want to volunteer for the Red Cross? What would you say to them?
I'd tell them that I would say to them, well, this is certainly a worthwhile organization to participate in and continue to be a member in. They're very honest about what they do. As much as possible goes into their pocket, their volunteer work. I think much more goes into their volunteer work than any other organization at that time did. It used to make me so mad, these movie actors and actresses would get paid a very fancy sum of money for volunteering to do one act one time. And yet the Red Cross volunteers never asked for a penny the way it was. I think they're very giving in anything that they do, the Red Cross can do, they do.
When you look back on all your years of volunteer service through the Red Cross, how would you sum that up? How would you tell someone, what your experience was?
I'd say it's a very worthwhile experience. I've done volunteer work all my life, and I continue even now of doing whatever is possible for the Red Cross.
Okay, I have two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Number one question is, Hawaii is, you've been all over the world, you've traveled.
Mm-hmm.
What makes Hawaii different? Why is this place so different, so special? I mean, you continue to live here.
The weather is so perfect. I married a man who was born and raised here, and he stayed here, and so I stayed here naturally. He passed away in '96, and I was with him the whole time. What else did he?
What is, and my last question, unless you have any more questions. Okay, so my last question is, what is something that no one really knows about you and your time in the Red Cross? What is something that people don't know that you did or happened to you?
Well, I've given money, anonymous, to quite a few organizations, national and local. Because I think it's certainly worthwhile following through with some things. You can't do a volunteer job and then just suddenly, boom, stop. You've let all these people that have volunteered too off the hook. I mean, not exactly off the hook, but free to do what they want to do. And I just have always been a volunteer in helping, and I like the Red Cross very much because you could do all types of things, and they're always there to volunteer. In foreign countries, they're the first ones there. In many places, I know my daughter has gone to quite a few places to fill in. She just got back a little while ago from, where was she, Mary? She was in...
When they had the fire.
Her daughter, Valerie Brooks, is a Red Cross volunteer on the Big Island.
Oh,
She's
okay.
continuing her legacy of volunteering.
Right. Okay.
I'm sorry, at my age, I'm a little vague on a lot of things.
Not at all.
And I repeat myself many times.
You've given a lot of detail, actually. And it's a fascinating story. I lied. I have more questions now that you answered that last one. Where does the spirit of generosity come from? Is this something that's learned, or
it's learned? You learn it from your parents. Daddy always felt that we should give, since we were very lucky and having financially being well off. You get more enjoyment out of life if you give. And I have found that very, very true. Some things I don't need, so why go off and spend something for a very fancy car that all you need is transportation from here to there. The car I have now is about 10 or 11 years old, I think, and I think my car is about 10 or 11 years old, too.
Do you still drive?
Oh, I drove all the time. I would drive in the dark when we'd go out to Shafter during the war. We were only allowed to, if you had permission to drive a car, then you had your light fixtures on your car were all painted black, except for about an inch wide little slit that went across it like that. It just is about an inch, wide. It went across it, and that's all the light you had. And so you made use of every little bit of it. You were rationed in gas, 10 gallons a month, I think it was, that you could have.
You know, your experience during this period of time in the 40s, late 30s to 40s, 50s, this is not the typical lifestyle for a woman of your age during this period of time, was it not?
I don't know. My parents were volunteers. My husband's parents were great volunteers. My husband's father started the Red Cross. Well, he was very active in the Red Cross too, I think. And he started the what would you say? When they'd bring people in for entertainment, they had a USO, yes. So these fancy people who would volunteer to sing songs that was very famous, and they'd get up and sing, and they usually got paid about half of what they normally would get paid.
Okay, I think we're good.
I just had one question. You have a button, a Red Cross button that says Parker Ranch, which is on the Big Island.
Yes.
Did you volunteer as a Red Cross volunteer on Parker Ranch?
You'll have to speak a little louder.
What did the Red Cross do on Parker Ranch? Because you have a button that says Parker Ranch.
I think they had it as a volunteer place. Parker Ranch was a volunteer place for officers and some enlisted people to relax, and they also had training there.
That's all I have.
Right. I didn't even know there was.
I know.
So you were there. You were there at Parker Ranch.
No, when the war started.
Or at any time?
Anytime, yes.
Yeah.
I was up there. I was in Honolulu. I volunteered. I don't know when I started volunteering. Well, I started volunteering when I was old enough to know what it was all about.
Okay.
And
okay, I think we're good. That's quite a story. Thanks for sharing it.
well, you're very welcome.
Yeah, we learned a lot.
7 of us in the family, children, 7 children. We were all pretty much volunteers, but which we had been taught by our father to be, and Dad Atherton was a great volunteer. I don't know, we just always, that was part of our lives. I can't think of anything else. I know I fumbled and dumbled around here.
Not at all.
What was your father-in-law's first name?
But
Because I know the name. Your father-in-law's first name?
Frank.
Frank Atherton. I bet you have
So,
Mm-hmm. And I